Welcome to the AQ podcast. I'm Luisa Franco in this week for Brian Winter. As the political climate continues to deteriorate in Peru, what could be the result of the country's long crisis?
This is the thing. We're seeing this, I think, a new model of democratic backsliding in Latin America, where it's not populist strongmen necessarily leading the charge. It's these loose alliances of political parties and interests. But the flip side of that is it's very hard to erode democracy this way because you need to keep so many different actors under the umbrella of these same coalitions, right? And united to vote on these same laws that are detrimental to democracy and the judiciary.
Are you concerned about Peru, but not quite sure how to think about it? So are we. Political developments there have been so consequential and fast-moving that it's hard to keep track of how they connect to each other and what their effect is on Peru's democracy and its economy. This week, Prime Minister Alberto Otarola said he'd resign after an audio recording came out of him apparently attempting to improperly influence government contracts. And as we release this episode, Congress is set to vote on removing the members of the Junta Nacional de Justicia, a body that was created in 2019, which in practice selects members of the judiciary. It's all part of a bigger pattern of political instability in Peru, going back 6 or 7 years now, that has continued under current President Dina Boluarte. So today we thought we'd ask several big questions about Peru. Is the country's democracy itself in danger? What are the underlying forces driving all this instability? And what's the effect been on Peru's key industries and the lives of Peruvian citizens? Our guest today on this episode is Will Freeman, who's followed Peru closely as a fellow for Latin American Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations and as a columnist for AQ. So, Will, the day this airs, Thursday, could be a very important day in Peruvian politics because Congress is planning to vote on removing the members of the Junta Nacional de Justicia, a body that was created to select members of the judiciary. And it looks like there's a majority to remove them. So could you just explain to us how important is this body? What are the implications of this vote? And what does this say about the state of Peruvian politics today?
The Junta Nacional de Justicia is hugely important to the Peruvian state. This is an institution which, as you mentioned, is only a few years old, but concentrates really important power. Its 7 members are in charge of appointing and ratifying all judges and prosecutors in the country and removing those that break or violate laws. And those powers have put the junta in the last few years at the center of this swirling controversy. That is that the junta took it as its task to purge the judiciary of organized crime corruption, of judges who allegedly had cut deals, accepted bribes from suspected narco traffickers and other figures in politics involved in corruption and in the criminal underworld. So the junta was pursuing this judicial cleanup, but eventually that put it at loggerheads with certain actors in Congress and also with Peru's ex-Attorney General, Patricia Benavides. And this showdown was brewing over the past several months. There were attempts throughout 2023 to oust the members of the junta by Congress, and now you're finally seeing it come to a head. So just to conclude here, I think if Congress effectively does remove the Junta Nacional de Justicia, they will essentially in their hands have control over the judiciary. And not only that, they will also have sort of a backdoor means of removing and replacing most of the authorities that run elections in Peru, who are coming up for renewal next year. So we're talking about some very far-reaching changes, potentially, to the political system.
Congress seems to be the driving force behind much of these pressures on institutions. What specifically are the groups pushing for this removal of the junta members? And how would you describe this alliance of interests represented in the Peruvian Congress today more broadly?
Well, there's a pact or a loose alliance of forces in Congress that have been pushing for this vote to purge the junta, as well as several other measures to curb transparency and the independence of different institutions. And on the face of it, they make for a set of strange bedfellows. The largest bloc in this group is Fujimorismo. the party of Keiko Fujimori and her family, who are reduced from their peak numbers in Congress several years ago, but they're still a significant block of seats. But you do have them also allying then with the far left Peru Libre Party, which originally put Castillo in office. Now it's back to being controlled by Waldemar Cerrón, the brother of the founder of that party, Vladimir Cerrón, who's a fugitive from justice. So you have the far left and the right-wing Fujimoristas working together to push this vote against the junta. And then there's several other smaller parties that tend to fall in line with these initiatives. So one is the Alliance for Progress. That's the party, the third biggest in Congress, controlled by Cesar Acuña, a business mogul who owns many private universities and has been pushing for their deregulation. He's also actively investigated for money laundering. And, going down the list, you also have parties like the far-right party of Lima's mayor, Rafael Lopez Arriaga, Popular Renovation. That's just to name a few. In a system as fragmented as Peru, there are many more factions. But where they tend to come together is on these initiatives to weaken rule of law. Just last December, you saw them appoint a new constitutional court judge with zero public debate. They passed a measure to weaken plea bargaining tools that prosecutors have at their disposal to investigate organized crime and money laundering. And they also passed a law that's now colorfully known in Peru as the Anti-Forests Law. It waters down environmental protections for parts of the Amazon. So that's just a brief summary, but it shows you that there are varied actors here pushing for these changes in Peru, but they tend to form an alliance and right now seem determined to purge the junta.
We have seen many Peruvian analysts say that the country's democracy is under threat. And in our conversations about politics today, we often talk about the trend of democratic backsliding, not just in Latin America, but other parts of the world too. And that backsliding takes very different shapes depending on which country you're looking at, right? So as we observe Peru now, it seems to me distinct from what's happening in El Salvador, for example, right? And often as I read the news coming from there, it makes me think of Guatemala's Pacto de Corruptos, which one guest on this podcast last year described as this sort of loose confederation of people who represent sort of some business interests, who share certain goals and at times are rivals and adversaries, but have generally agreed that it's better to share power among themselves than to let somebody else in who might upset the whole system. What do you think? Like, what's a good model to think about what's happening in Peru today?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Alberto Vergara is one Peruvian writer who's been talking about this. Rosa Maria Palacios has been pretty well-known commentator, has been talking about how Peru is following the path of Guatemala. So this is the thing. We're seeing this, I think, a new model of democratic backsliding in Latin America, where it's not populist strongmen necessarily leading the charge. It's these loose alliances of political parties and interests. You saw that certainly in Guatemala. Now I think you're seeing it in Peru. But the flip side of that is it's very hard to erode democracy this way because you need to keep so many different actors under the umbrella of these same coalitions, right? And united to vote on these same laws that are detrimental to democracy and the judiciary. I think there's two dimensions we can look at here in terms of gauging the extent of democratic backsliding in Peru. So one is the rule of law. In terms of the rule of law, Peru was making a lot of progress in the 2010s. The country became famous for investigating its ex-presidents, did a very thorough job investigating the Odebrecht scandal. It all seemed like this was building into quite a bit of momentum, ending impunity. But unfortunately, I think so one plank of this democratic backsliding you've seen over the past couple of years is that you've seen a backlash coalition take shape. Congress, eventually the former Attorney General Patricia Benavides, joining together to effectively stop these investigations, fire the top investigators, pass laws that made it harder for prosecutors to investigate money laundering, campaign finance corruption, et cetera. So that's one element along which, or one dimension along which I think you're seeing democratic erosion. The other is that you're really seeing an erosion of separation of powers in Peru. Now, the Freedom House just released their most recent index of democracy around the world. Peru lost more points than any other country in Latin America. So just in terms of its relative decline from its score last year, it was the biggest drop. And that's really because Congress, since late 2022, early 2023, has been remarkably effective at gaining control of independent institutions. Again, we're used to in Latin America seeing presidents lay claim to independent state agencies, trim the wings of other branches of government. But in Peru, Congress is really leading that charge. They essentially managed to put in place a raft of constitutional tribunal judges allied with major lawmakers. They managed to get a friendly prosecutor in the Attorney General's office, Benavides, who we've been talking about. Congress now controls effectively the Ombudsman's office, which names several other important state authorities. And finally, lawmakers have managed to purge and pack regulatory bodies that oversee important parts of the economy, like higher education and transportation. Right now, if you take an honest look at it, there are really only two powers that Congress has not managed to co-opt in Peru. One is the Junta Nacional de Justicia, which we've been talking about, and the other are the electoral authorities. And I'm afraid that with this vote on Thursday, we could see a very decisive turning point where those final two powers that are not under the control of Congress, actually lose that independence.
As you know, I'm from Brazil, and for years under Bolsonaro, we lived with this constant existential threat to our democracy. And in the end, we were able to salvage it with many, many problems remaining. Do you see a similar sight on the horizon for Peru? What are the forces in Peruvian democracy today that are working to resist backsliding?
Right. It's a great question. I mean, what I see in Brazil, not being a Brazil expert myself, is that there was enough judicial independence and enough pushback on the part of society that you could stop a coup coalition from coming together or a coalition from coming together that wanted to overturn the results of an election. I think what's more disconcerting about Peru is that, if you ask me, the main force right now holding back this pact in Congress from finishing off democracy, taking control of the rest of the independent institutions, it's really just their own incompetence and their own struggles to unite themselves. It's their own lack of internal cohesion. So I think that that's the main force, unfortunately, right now that's preserving independent institutions in Peru. It's not that most Peruvians support what's happening. Certainly all the polls tell us that they don't. Peru's Congress is perhaps the least popular of any in the entire region. Dina Boluarte hovers between 10 and 15% approval in any given poll, so also making her one of the least popular heads of state in the region. But I do think there is both a certain amount of apathy among the population in Peru, a feeling that even if there are new elections, there's a serious risk that you'll end up with actors that represent these same interests we see now dominating Congress. And then on the other hand, I think there's still quite a bit of fear left over from the harsh repression we saw in the wake of the mass protests of late 2022, early 2023. So civil society, in a sense, is demobilized by that. The independent institutions like the Junta Nacional de Justicia that hold out is just a handful of people we're talking about. So I think, unfortunately, here, the main barrier is simply the difficulty of organizing such a broad coalition behind a vote like this one.
Moving to the executive, Will, Dina Boluarte, right? She comes in as Castillo's vice president. He's a leftist from the countryside. He faces resistance and corruption allegations, attempts a coup, and is sent to jail. She takes over and moves to the right and exerts her control over the population with violence, cracking down heavily on protests. She's incredibly unpopular. She has 14% approval, according to the latest Ipsos polls. How does she keep herself in power?
I think she was able to keep herself in power because this harsh repressive response to the protests effectively demobilized them in early 2023. And even by mid 2023, July, when you saw the next big attempt to rally protests, not as many people were willing to turn out. You also saw Congress make several votes about whether they would speed up the electoral cycle and hold elections perhaps in 2024, sometime ahead of the next scheduled general elections, which are for 2026. There, Congress was also Congress played its own role, making sure that they would hold on to their jobs as long as possible. I think she's under the thumb of Congress. They're clearly in the driver's seat. There's no real issue I've seen where she's willing to put her foot down and challenge them. Just take one example. Over the past week, Boluarte met with a bipartisan delegation of visiting members of the U.S. Congress. And after that meeting, in which apparently judicial independence was discussed, she said, well, I think Congress might want to reconsider its vote on the junta. But it was really a mild statement. And we haven't seen her repeat that or come out boldly on the side of the Junta Nacional de Justicia. So I think that gives you a bit of a sense that ultimately Boluarte here is backed into a corner. She doesn't have her own base of popular support to rely on, like, say, Peruvian ex-president Martin Vizcarra, who went head-to-head with Congress and had 70% of the population behind him. Boluarte finds herself in a much weaker position. And I think that's why today it's truly Congress that steers the show.
As we record this, it looks like Prime Minister Alberto Otarola will resign after an audio recording came out of him apparently attempting to improperly influence government contracts, right? What do we know about this case, and what are the possible consequences?
Last Sunday, Panorama, a Peruvian media outlet, released an audio tape that seems to show Prime Minister Alberto Otarola speaking to a woman promising her a job, government contracts, also seeming to treat her as his romantic partner, although she seems quite uneasy. And it's raised concerns both that he was engaging in sexual harassment and also that he was unfairly promising a government contract as sort of a personal favor. It ended up that the woman in question did receive a government contract then from the Ministry of Defense, which he was in charge of at the time. Both Otarola and the woman in question have denied that illegal activity took place, but President Boluarte has, according to Peruvian media, asked for Otarola's resignation. And if he does resign, it could mark a period of instability for her government. Since he came on as prime minister in December 2022, Otarola has been seen by many in Peru as the real decision maker behind the presidency. If he's out, how Boluarte relates to Congress, how she tries to keep control of that relationship, I think those are all open questions.
We'll be back with more after a short break.
The American Society Art Gallery is currently showing the second part of El Dorado, Myths of Gold, a group exhibition exploring the legend of El Dorado as a foundational myth of the Americas. Art at American Society is the longest-standing space in the U.S. dedicated to exhibiting and promoting art from Latin America and the Caribbean. El Dorado Myths of Gold will be on view in New York until May 18, 2024.
A trend that we've seen in the region lately is the encroachment of organized crime. Perhaps the most blatant example is Ecuador recently. What's the status of these developments in Peru today, would you say?
So I think, fortunately, among Peru's relatively few blessings right now, you can count the low levels of violence. Peru actually saw a reduction in its national homicide rate over the past year, according to Inside Crime. And while you do have extensive criminal activity, it's not reached this crisis level that we see in, say, Ecuador. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned. So just going down the list, I mean, going back decades, Peru has been one of the world's largest producers of coca and remains an important part of the cocaine supply chain, if you will. That leads to a lot of corruption among security forces and local officials in coca growing areas. It doesn't tend to make its way into influencing national level politics, talking cabinets or the national government. You do see other concerning types of crime. Extortion, by all accounts, is rising in Lima. That's been causing a lot of friction, tension around Lima, and I think driving a perception of increased insecurity, even if, as I mentioned, murders have not shot up. And then on top of that, you are seeing this really powerful push by illegal miners and loggers to plunder the country's natural resources and get rich in the process. And I think when you add that all up against the backdrop of eroding rule of law, you're looking at a very concerning future for Peru. So I personally worry about, what if Peru's ports become more important to international cocaine trafficking? What if, as there's more and more opportunity to make money off of illegal economies, what if there's also more competition like we've seen in neighboring Ecuador? And what sort of consequences could those lead to down the road for Peru? So for me, those are really the concerning questions when it comes to crime.
And how would you say that this, as well as these other pressures on Peru's institutions that we've been referring to, how has this affected Peru's key industries? As we know, Peru relies heavily on extractivist industries like mining, for example. What are the risks there?
Well, I think that, we're not seeing crime create the kind of sheer instability, for instance, in neighboring Ecuador in Peru. So you're not seeing a huge barrier to investment there. But I do think in terms of corruption, criminal corruption of the judiciary, I mean, that erodes one of the basic pillars you'd want to, if you're an investor looking at Peru, you'd want to know that there is an independent judiciary that makes decisions based on the law, not based on who offers the biggest bribes. But unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen that narco trafficking groups, illegal fishing moguls, other actors in the illegal economy have managed to co-opt and actually buy judicial decisions at a very high level. That's something the Junta Nacional de Justicia has been investigating since 2019. And I think there's sort of a more indirect way that crime could hurt investment in Peru, not so much through huge flare-ups and violence, but rather through eroding independent institutions, regulatory bodies, courts, and making them less trustworthy arbiters. I just add to that outside of the issue of crime, social conflict is, I think, the bigger threat to investment in Peru. Take, for instance, the legal copper industry. You have a copper mine like Las Bambas in Peru, which I think supplies something like 2% of the world's copper, connected by just one or two roads to the major highway networks in Peru along the coast. So all it really takes there is one large sustained local protest to cause a major snarl in that supply chain. So what's really critical for Peru is to have the institutions to manage that kind of social conflict and come to consensus with communities living in the vicinity of mines. And I think that that's where you've actually seen, unfortunately, backward steps since late 2022, early 2023. That's why I think we see copper investment, for instance, in Peru falling 16% this year and predicted to fall another 7% in 2024. Often what demonstrators want is to see, or what they say they want is to see the fruits of this investment. They want to see revenue from mining distributed locally. And a difficulty you run into here is that actually Peru, by the books, has pretty good laws on sharing revenues from mining at the local level, to distributing them to communities that live in the vicinity of mines and tend to be very poor. But oftentimes, even though local governments will get that revenue, that mining revenue, into their coffers, they won't spend it effectively, or it'll be lost to corruption. So I think that here, the problem we're really running into is a weak local state in Peru. It's that municipal governments, regional governments don't have the technical capacity, or they're not accountable enough to actually make sure that that these revenues make it down to the level of families, communities, block by block, making a tangible difference in people's lives.
Peru, as we know, was one of the countries that did best in the region in terms of reducing poverty in the 2000s, right? Now growth has slowed significantly. What's been the effect of all this on most Peruvians?
Well, I think the slowdown in economic growth, which used to be so high in Peru, has affected those groups, especially heavily the poor. And, you have seen poverty levels went back up during the pandemic, as they did in so many Latin American countries. You've seen them come down close to pre-pandemic levels. But what you're not seeing is sort of sustained social mobility, more and more people moving into the middle class, which was the story of the 2000s and 2010s in Peru. And I think that's leading to a lot of popular frustration, again, on that bottom end of the income distribution. This shocked me when I learned it, but just between January and June of 2023, according to government figures, 400,000 Peruvians left the country without returning. That's a shocking number. That's much larger than in pre-pandemic years. And so far, what we're seeing in June 2023 until now is that trend has continued. Now, most are not joining the stream of people reaching the U.S. southern border on foot. You're seeing between 4,000 and 5,000 Peruvians reaching the U.S.-Mexico border per month, so many fewer than Venezuelans, Mexicans, Guatemalans. You're seeing Peruvians go to Europe, go to different destinations, but you're still seeing a mass exodus of people from the country, which reaches kind of across classes. You're seeing it among graduates of expensive private colleges. You're also seeing it among people affected by the El Nino weather cycle, who are struggling to make ends meet as farmers. So I think it speaks to the sense that everyone in Peru is wondering what's the horizon. If growth is slowing, if corruption seems unstoppable, and if Congress is managing to control different institutions and potentially lock in the same set of actors into power for years to come, what's the hope on the horizon? How would you restart that story of social mobility and declining poverty and increasing opportunities that you saw in Peru? And I'm not sure we see the answer to that question yet.
Well, as we look ahead, what are the key events to watch as we try to make sense of political developments in Peru, do you think?
Well, I'll be looking to see whether in 2025 and early 2026, the National Elections Board, which helps organize elections, whether or not its leadership remains independent or is replaced with a leadership more in line with the dominant blocs in Congress. We'll be looking to see the same in the electoral registry, which controls voter rolls. Those are just two instances. But I think more broadly, and zooming out from the specific institutions, I'll be looking to see if there's any increase in trust and confidence of the Peruvian population towards their government. I just don't know how long a democracy can survive with 95% of the people against its Congress, with 90% of people against the president, and with some of the lowest levels of expressed trust in institutions in the entire region. I think some increase in trust is almost necessary to keep a democratic system functioning in Peru. I think it's important to also point out Peru's extreme resilience over the course of its history. Take Peru in the 1980s. It was a country in which a brutal Maoist insurgency was gaining control of ever more territory. There was hyperinflation. The political system, the parties that we see today have fragmented. They were just beginning to collapse. There were bank crises. There were long extended power outages in Lima by the late 1980s, early 1990s. The 2000s and 2010s in Peru, whatever the faults of the political economic model, look incomparably better. And not only that, Peru made a concerted effort to hold to account its former leaders for breaking the law, for corrupt behavior, and I think had more success at that project than is often realized. So if you compare Peru to where it was decades ago, it still looks like it's in a better place. There are concerning sides of backward motion now. And I think if we're complacent, if actors aren't careful, Peru could end up back in a situation like its 1980s or 1990s in terms of entrenched corruption, a non-democratic government, et cetera. But it's also a country that's shown its ability to pull back from the brink time and time again. And at a time when demand for copper is expected to reach a peak around the world, where Peru still has, I think, a technocratic, set of technocrats who know how to manage the economy well, make it grow, and reduce poverty. I think that this story, the verdict isn't out yet. That's why it's so important to watch Peru now and hope that the country is able to maintain the democratic institutions and rule of law that have helped it function over the years.
And if we can remain with the Guatemala comparison, we definitely have a positive surprise with the election of Bernardo Arévalo and his being able to take office, which wasn't clear would happen.
Right. Another case of a country that surprised many.
Well, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's been very illuminating.
Thank you, Luisa. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced by Luisa Franco and edited in partnership with Human Group Media.